get started. Welcome everyone to Spartan Training, the second installation of Spartan Training. And if you're not familiar, this is where we get to go through different questions within the faith, and we get to hear from different people who know about this information. So tonight it is being led by Daniel Barth, a very own high-kicking, high-chopping karate man. And the question is, how can we trust the Bible? So without further ado, here is Daniel.
Thank you, Carson. Tonight, really, what I want to do is just give an objective view of what is some of this stuff historically about the Bible. There's so much information about it. People have so many questions about it. How the heck does all of that add up and stack up in comparison to the rest of history and the ways that we typically view historical documents and things like that? So I'm going to cover basically three main things, and then I'm going to open it up to you guys. I want to leave lots of time at the end for you guys to ask questions. If there are specific things that you're curious about that come up in the talk or whatever, I want to be able to have a dialogue about that. But basically, the three questions that I'm going to look to answer are: how does the New Testament compare to other documents historically, specifically around that time period? The second question is, we have a million translations of the Bible in tons of different languages. How do we know that it was copied correctly? We're talking about a book that was written over 2,000 years ago. Like, there was obviously been a very long copying process. How can I know that the Bible that I have in my hands today is the same Bible that was in their hands in 300 AD? And lastly, just want to talk about, was there motivation for the writers of the Bible to do it? Like, was there something that they got out of the deal that would cause them to write such a book? So let's dive into the first question. How does the New Testament stack up against other historical texts and documents? So I'm going to share my screen here. Got a little graphic for you. So basically how they track documents is like through original copies and manuscripts. So copies of documents that are written down through eyewitness accounts or people who were taught specific pieces of information. So here, the top one you probably had to read in high school, like I did, the Iliad by Homer, written in 800 BC. It's all about the Trojan War, which you've probably seen tons and tons of movies about, different things in pop culture. Certainly has covered that time period pretty specifically. And you can see in the right, the number of copies that we have that, talk about those specific events. So we see 643 for the Iliad. The rest, not very many copies, different pieces of history from the time period, only a small number of copies. And then if you see the category second to the right, time gap, tells you when it was written as opposed to when they discovered the first copies of the text. So we see for most of them, it's several hundred years, if not 1,000 years, that, okay, Homer wrote it in 800 BC. We find the earliest copy in 400 BC. So there's a 400-year gap in between when the events that he's talking about happened to when they actually discovered it and were able to record it and recognize it as history. If we look at the bottom, which is just the New Testament, so the second half of the Bible, written between 50 years, 50 to 100 AD, and then we see all of the different copies. So starting in 114 AD, they had collected several fragments. So a fragment is essentially just a copy that gets a little bit tattered, or like maybe the page is ripped, whatever. They can't make out the whole thing, but they know enough of it to be able to recognize it as, oh, that's like a couple verses from the book of John or whatever book it was from. And then we see down the line, by 325 AD, they have copies for basically the complete New Testament. So 225 years after it was written. And the number of copies that they have on that far right side is 5,366. So we see right off the bat, this is a much larger number than any of the other texts on this list by a long shot. And that number, that 5,366, is only in the original Greek. So the New Testament was written in Greek. So we have over 5,000 copies written in the original Greek, but then we also have over 24,000 copies and fragments and other various parts of it that are in different languages like Coptic, Syrian, Armenian, Latin, tons of different languages, tons of different copies all throughout history. So if we're going to recognize like the Trojan War that the Iliad writes about as history, we've made movies about it, we talk about it in pop culture, you probably learned about it in school. I haven't met a single person who said, yeah, I don't think the Trojan War happened. I think that that's just a bunch of fake garbage that, this Greek guy made up when he wrote it, thousands of years ago. Nobody denies its existence. And yet, just for the New Testament, we have significantly more evidence. I mean, over 5,000 more copies than we have of the Iliad. So to deny the New Testament and to say that the things that happen in the New Testament, like if you were to say that Jesus isn't a person, like he never existed, he never walked the earth, or the events that get talked about in the New Testament historically, well, they just don't add up. That's just a bunch of folklore that got passed down from generation to generation. Well, I would say that argument literally can't hold up. To deny the New Testament is to deny all of history from that time period, because there's not a document or piece of literature that's more proven based on the number of copies that we have than the New Testament. So that's just taking care of question one. Okay, I know that the New Testament has a lot more evidence than maybe I thought it did compared to the rest of history that we study. So then what else do I do with that? Again, written a very long time ago. What are the skeptics of the Bible saying? How the heck can I know that this that I have in my hand right now in 2021 is the same book than what we were talking about back then? So I will share this quote again. This is from, pretty popular stance if you were someone who was anti-Bible or anti being historical and accurate. So it says, there are no original manuscripts to any biblical book. The Bible has been translated so many times and into so many languages that it stands to reason that the Bible would have changed over time. How can a Christian have confidence that what they believe, what the Bible says today, is what the original biblical books even said? Not a bad question, right? Certainly a fair point in saying, well, we don't have any of the original books. Like, we don't have the letter that John or Luke or Mark or Matthew actually wrote themselves. We don't have the physical copy of that first letter, like in a museum somewhere that we can just go look at it. So if we don't have the original, how can we know that what got passed down over years and years and years and translated in all these different languages is actually what it said? Well, there are people that are a lot smarter than me, lucky, that have spent their entire lives devoted to figuring this particular process out. So as I said before, there's 30,000-ish copies in all types of different languages, fragments, complete books. So when we have so many copies of the same text, we're able to compare, okay, well, this fragment might be in Latin and this fragment might be in Greek, but they're written about the same passages. They're copying the same passages. So let me compare and contrast with all of these different languages and all these different copies that I have in order to see, does the main message of the gospel, what the writers are communicating, does it hold up as I compare different copies? Because as long as I have tons of different copies to draw from, I can see very clearly, well, this one's totally off, this one's off, there's not a cohesive, unified message, or I can see that they generally agree with each other. So as we compare copies in the Bible that have been translated over time, you'll find that there is over 95% accuracy in terms of this translation to that translation, this language to that language, different time period, 500 years ago to now, different things that we've discovered and translated, that it translates with over 95% accuracy. And the 5% inaccuracy that causes them to reject certain passages and reject certain things and say, oh, that's an inaccuracy, was all based upon spelling errors and word usage, like different types of synonyms and things like that. There was nothing that popped up when comparing copies of translations that was so alarming that it was like, oh my gosh, we got to throw this thing out. Like the gospel is clearly not cohesive or unified. It proved just the opposite, actually, that this is the same stuff. And this is being copied by different people in different regions during different time periods. And yet it's saying the exact same thing. So on this next slide, I just made a little example to show you what you might encounter. So the statement, the Lord showed them favor and mercy, would be what a copy says. And then you can see as you look down the list, well, each of them looks a little bit different. There's a couple spelling errors, like in that second one. Well, I forgot the E when I typed showed. One favor has a U, the other is just an O. I misspelled them in the fourth one. The fifth one, I said kindness instead of favor. The third one says the people instead of them. And yet, if I have 100 of these statements in different copies and translations, I can see clearly that the translation or what it's trying to communicate is the Lord showed them favor and mercy. Whoever the people are, whoever he's talking about, whatever the context of the passage is, I can read this and say, okay, I get what they're trying to say. There's just a couple that get rejected because they got spelled incorrectly. I mean, these guys are copying by hand back then the entire Bible. Like we can give them a little bit of a little bit of slack if they misspell a word or two. But these are the errors that fall under that 5% category. So am I confident that like the Bible is translated correctly based on that information? Absolutely. And if you need a little bit more convincing, here is one of the, I mean, it is the premier Christian discovery in terms of proof that the texts are what they originally were. So here is a picture of a place called the Qumran Caves. It is in the Judean desert in Israel, right next to the Dead Sea. And in 1946, a group of herdsmen were traveling through this area, and they found in these caves a bunch of like unusual clay jars. So they opened up the jars, and what they found in them were tons and tons of scrolls with original Hebrew writing. So they don't really know what these things are. Again, this is 1946, less than 100 years ago. They come to find out over time that these scrolls were written by farmers who lived in this particular area to from 150 BC to 70 AD. And they were copying the Bible. And they found out that Romans were about to invade their territory. So they took all of these scrolls and all of these texts, and they hid them in these clay jars in these caves. And they weren't discovered for thousands of years. And then they finally, these herdsmen stumble upon them. They don't even really know what they are. So they take them into town and they sell these scrolls off for like $300, 300 US dollars in like 2019. And what they found, a scholar gets a hold of these and says, holy crap, these are original copies of, they had every book in the Old Testament other than Esther. They had at least either a fragment or a full book of every single book in the Old Testament copied in the Hebrew language from 100 BC. These scrolls were written in 100 BC and they didn't get discovered until 1946. Like, how crazy is that? And what kind of the crown jewel of the discovery was, it had the entire book of Isaiah. All 66 chapters of Isaiah penned in 100 BC. When Isaiah actually wrote the letter, it was probably 700 BC. So 600 years after Isaiah had written his letter, they are copying this letter and they hide it away in these caves. It gets discovered and they have the full book of it. So these are referred to as the Dead Sea Scrolls. So here's a picture of it. You can see how big it is. That is Isaiah, all 66 chapters in a museum in Israel. I'm gonna exit out of this and go over here. So this is, they made like an HD version of it that you can interact with. So this is what they have here. You can scroll through, you can click on it and actually read the verse in the translation This is like 2,000 years old. I mean, it's mind-blowing to me that this stuff exists. You can scroll through and read all 66 chapters and see the English translation. Pretty neat discovery, if I do say so myself. So, what does that really mean? Well, as we've, again, 95% accurate, 5% error just for spelling. So we in 2021 are able to look at that and say, when I read Isaiah in my Bible, it is the same Isaiah from 100 BC. So all of the people that would argue that this stuff has been manipulated over time and it's just a bunch of fairy tales that people have kind of passed down from one generation to the next, it simply doesn't add up, because we have a very original copy from the time period. And even original, I mean, that's 600 years later. So this stuff has been being copied for centuries. And we have the evidence that, hey, this stuff was actually copied correctly. It wasn't just people using it for a power grab or using it for some kind of influence and things like that. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are super, super important in terms of proving the validity of what we read today in the Bible. So there's some of the information. Thanks for sticking with me through that. I know that sometimes, like, oh man, that's a lot of numbers and a lot of things that don't make that much sense to me. So let's talk more about the practical. Well, what does that really mean for us then? What about the people who penned these letters? What about the people who were kind of in charge of copying this stuff over time? Were they in a position to benefit from the things that they were doing? I have kind of a theory. It's probably not that drastic of a theory, but I think the three reasons that people are motivated to do much of anything, whatever it is, I think that you can trace most things back in your own life to you're going to gain something financially from it. Like, there's an incentive in it for you money-wise. There's power or influence to be gained. Like, hey, you'll be able to kind of climb the ladder a little bit. Or there's sex, like basic human need. Everyone desires it. They want it. So what is my motivation for doing a lot of things in life? It's for one of those three things, if not all three things at the same time. So how about these people who wrote the Bible? Because a lot of skeptics and critics would argue that the reason that the Bible was written and preached and all of this stuff happened was just so that the church and the religious leaders could make their pockets a little thicker. They stood to make money. They stood to gain power and influence over the empires that they lived in. And, maybe there's a little bit of incentive for some women along with it. So I want to take a closer look at the disciples in particular, or just people who walked with Jesus in the New Testament. What about these guys? So if you know anything about the disciples, you know that these guys were simple tradesmen. They were either fishermen or they performed crafts. They were kind of like the local boys in the area that they were in, just your average like labor workers. There was nothing special about them status wise. So it's feasible to say, well, they kind of come from a very humble beginning. So maybe there is a little bit of motivation for them to, like, hey, they can get in these religious circles and they can mix it up and they can get out of, they can stand to gain from getting out of the situations that they're in. Okay. But what does Jesus say to his disciples, to people who are following him? First of all, he tells them, hey, you're basically going to give up everything. It's going to cost you a lot to follow me. And here is a specific verse, as he's addressing them. So this comes out of Mark. So verses 34 through 36 in chapter 8. It says, then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? So he's saying, if you want to follow me, you've got to take up your cross. Take up your cross essentially means deny yourself. All of those things that you desire in your flesh, money, power, sex, all of that stuff, like there's not going to be any of that if you're going to walk with me. Not only is there not going to be any of that, you're going to lose a lot, probably luxury, your friends, family. People are going to disagree with you. You're going to lose people who are important to you, and you might potentially even lose your life. It might come to that. That is the cost for what following me will have. And yet the reward they viewed as something that was so much greater than what it cost them. So as they traveled around long after Jesus had died, Jesus goes through his crucifixion on the cross, he resurrects, but then the disciples are kind of on their own in a way. But they still traveled far and wide preaching the things that Jesus had taught them. And they were generally pretty well received by the people. They were loved by people, much like Jesus was loved by people, and yet they were hated by those who were in power because they feared that if the church gained influence, if this message of Christianity gained influence, then all of a sudden the things that they had were gonna go by. So they received extremely poor treatment for most of their lives as they continued to travel and preach this message. Several of them suffered quite brutal deaths, as a matter of fact. I'll talk about a few of them. So Paul, who most people know, wrote 13 of the books in the New Testament, very popular figure. He was not one of the 12 disciples, but is widely considered, to be one of the guys for obvious reason in the New Testament. Well, if you know anything about Paul, you know that many of his letters were penned from prison. He was thrown in prison for preaching the gospel, again, as a threat to these religious leaders and people who controlled the money and the power. They didn't really like someone like Paul coming and shaking up things, especially as someone who was a former Jewish guy who had then converted, and all of a sudden his agenda wasn't quite the same as everyone else's agenda. So they didn't like him very much. And he was beheaded by Emperor Nero. Not a very fruitful end for him in the world's terms. Pretty bad way to go. Another apostle, Thomas, who you don't hear about too much necessarily in the New Testament, but was one of Jesus's guys. He was stabbed to death with spears in India while he was preaching the gospel. James, another one talked about quite often, has his own letter in the New Testament, the brother of Jesus. This is the only death that's actually talked about in the Bible other than the death of Judas, the disciple who betrays Jesus. James, it says in Acts 12, was executed with a sword by King Herod, who wanted to win favor with the Jewish people by persecuting Christians. So that was like a nice display of power that, like, hey, I'll be a king that's for you guys, and I'll take care of these other chumps that you don't like so much. And lastly, we have Peter. Peter, also a very popularly well-known figure for his one, walking on water with Jesus, and two, denying Christ 3 times. Lots of stories about Peter, but he was killed by Emperor Nero as well. And the story says he was crucified upside down because he didn't see himself worthy of dying the death that Jesus had died. And that one wrecks me every time. I just can't imagine that. Just I'm not even worthy of this. Like, crucify me upside down. These men that walked with Jesus and penned these letters that we read in the New Testament, telling us all about his life and who he was and the things that he went through, they gained nothing. They gained absolutely nothing by the world standard. In fact, they gave away a lot of the things that they had. They stood nothing to gain in terms of power or influence or money or any of that. They were mocked. They were made fun of by the people. They suffered brutal deaths in a lot of cases. I can't say it's the same for other, again, this is not, hear me when I say this, this is not a time to bash other people or other, other religions or other moments in history, but I can't say the same necessarily for someone like a Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. He stood to gain a lot of things by starting Mormonism. I'm not saying that he's guilty of those things. I'm saying he had a motive. He ran for president in the United States, certainly power and influence. The Mormon army was the second largest army in the United States, other than the actual government's army. He had over 30 wives, so he certainly was getting the sex side of the motive fulfilled. Money, power, influence, he had all of it. Again, does that mean that he's guilty? No, because just because you have a motive doesn't mean that you're guilty. But it is a reason to explain why someone might do something. What was the motive for a guy like Peter to be crucified upside down? That sure wouldn't be a motive for me. I'll tell you that much. Who wants that? Who desires that? And yet, these people saw Jesus alive. They walked with him. They learned from him. They studied. They studied under him. They watched him physically get crucified and suffer the most brutal death that anyone back then could suffer. Hours and hours of agony as you just hung there gasping for life. They watched him go through that as people spit on him and made fun of him and mocked him. And then they saw his physical body resurrected. It said that there's over 500 people who witnessed his resurrected body. How cool is that? If there was over 500 people in a courtroom in 2021 that all said, yeah, I saw that happen, we would say beyond a reasonable doubt that it is true and that it did really happen, because there's no way that 500 people hallucinated the same thing all at the same time. These guys saw this. They did life with Jesus. They wrote about him, and they passed these teachings down to the younger generation, who then copied and passed it to the next and the next and the next. And here we are in 2021 with this book that is the same book with the same message that was written when these guys were alive. How insane is that? It's beyond all comprehension to me that could actually be true. And yet history says it's over 95% correct. And the 5% that isn't correct is like a spelling error. So when Jesus makes the claims that he makes, and when he talks about, hey, it's going to cost you something and things like that, and yet the reward is going to be greater. This is the biggest thing that changed my life as someone who didn't grow up in the Christian church. I had no idea about anything of the Bible. I'm a cold, hard facts kind of person. That's what I wanted. There's no way that you can prove that Jesus existed, and there's no way that you can prove that he died on the cross and he rose again 3 days later. The tomb was just empty. How can you prove that? Well, we have all these copies. We have all of this stuff that's historically supported. So I ought to take it seriously. And then I started reading and I started studying, and I'm listening to these things that Jesus is saying. And I'm saying, okay, I know that Jesus existed. Like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are like the most read historians on the planet. If you want to consider them historians, I mean, that's really what they are in a way, because their things that they've written have been more read than any other piece of history ever. Okay, so I'm reading this. I know that it's history. I know that Jesus is doing this stuff. I know that he's saying these things. I had to make a decision. I had to take his claim seriously. I either believe he is who he says he is, or I think he's a liar. And I think that all these disciples are a bunch of crazy people who died for something that didn't make sense. One of the two is true. If I know that this book is historically accurate and I see the claims that it's making, I have to make a decision with the evidence that's presented to me. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you, hey, you need to make this decision, or I'm going to think less of you if you don't make this decision. All I'm saying is that don't take my word for it. Don't take these sources' words for it. Go investigate for yourself. Read these words that he's saying. I'll leave you with this. And then we can open up the floor for a little bit of question time, but this is one of the most famous verses in the Bible. John 3:16, one of the most Googled, you see it everywhere. It says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." These are the claims that the Bible is making. This is what the New Testament is saying. It's saying, God is saying, I sent my son to die for you, so that if you believe in him, you will not die yourself. Even though you will die physically, you will have an eternal life ahead of you, and your soul will not die. It will be well with your soul, regardless of what happens to your body. You think that Peter and Paul and Thomas and James believe that? They said, kill me. What I have is worth so much more than anything that this world could offer. The money, the power, the sex, all of it, I don't care. I think that the reward of knowing and following Jesus is worth so much more than anything that you could ever give me. And if that means that it cost me my life, then it cost me my life. But we have to make a decision, friends. So to those of you who are checking this stuff out, maybe you haven't grown up just like I didn't. You haven't really read the Bible before. You're still kind of getting a feel for all of this stuff. My encouragement to you would be to go read these claims for yourself. Go look at the history. Go look at the information that's out there. It's all on the internet. It's all readily available for us. And I get that it's a really daunting task. I get that it's a little bit scary. Like, where do you even begin? And I totally understand that. And if there's a conversation that you want to have about it, we're here for you. Any of the staff people, any of your spiritual leaders on your teams, we're happy to walk through that stuff with you. But don't let another day go by that you don't investigate this stuff for yourself, because this is serious business. And to those of you that say, I have placed my faith in Jesus, I would say that I follow him, I love him, I believe his words to be true. Don't ever stop preaching this stuff from the mountaintops. How could I not tell people about this? This is not just a book. Like, this is history. This is life. Like, I'm kidding myself if I think that my life there's something better to be gained by staying away from that and doing other things. My purpose as a follower of Jesus is to tell other people about this stuff, to share the knowledge that I've been given, that some great people who invested in me when I was a 17-year-old senior in high school, I want to do the same thing for others that they did for me. That's what I am called to do. Again, Jesus calls me to take up my cross and follow me, to deny myself, to turn away from the things of the world and to walk with him and to preach his word and to tell people about the good news that, like, he is who he says he is. So I hope that is an encouragement and a challenge to you. But yeah, right now, I mean, we got 20 minutes or so. Yeah, I'd love to be able, if you have specific questions about, some of the historical stuff, but also just in general, how the heck do I read this thing? Anything in between. Nothing is off limits. So whatever y'all have. All right. Yes, Carson, you are. He sent me a private message. So why don't you ask, not over chat, so everyone can hear it.
Sounds good. No, that was so good, Daniel. Thank you for that. But I do just have one question. So these books, these letters of the Bible, they were all brought together at one point and considered the Bible. They were considered one book, and that is called the canon. But there's other books out there that were excluded from the Bible in the first century church, and those are considered non-canonical books. So maybe like the Gospel of Mary, for instance. What kind of was like the determining factor in maybe including those books or not including those books in the first Bible?
Sure. It's a great question. And it's one that a lot of people have, because, again, the skeptics and people who would say, oh, the Bible is not really a cohesive thing that history agrees with, would say, I saw a show on the History Channel one time that's like the secrets of the apostles, the books that got left out. And people want to make a big ordeal out of that in an attempt to disprove what the Bible has. So what decided what got in the Bible and what didn't was a couple of factors. The first is authorship. We want to be able to trace back who actually wrote this letter, and was it the person who says that, that they were writing it. So when I'm reading the Gospel of John, it's John that wrote it. I know that he's the author. When I'm reading the Pauline epistles, I know that it's Paul who's writing to these different churches in different areas. So for some of these other books, for example, like the Gospel of Thomas is a big one that got excluded. Well, I just told you Thomas got killed by getting stabbed to death with spears in India, and it was 72 AD, I think, is when he died. That Gospel of Thomas didn't start showing up until around the 2nd century. So he certainly couldn't have written it if it's coming around this much later. And the contents in the books were not consistent with the contents of the New Testament. So, for example, in this Gospel of Thomas, it's talking about the church in a way that was far beyond the current development of what the church was. So you can't possibly be talking about the church in the 2nd century and making it seem as if it was written in between 50 AD and 100 AD. So the contents typically didn't match up at all with what the gospel actually was communicating. And they were usually penned by people who weren't actually, that was not written by Thomas. There's several others: Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Nicodemus, tons and tons of books like this. The thing that I would encourage you, again, is don't take my word for it. These things are available. We can go read them. And I think when you read them, you'll see that this doesn't even come close to conveying the same messages that the Bible is conveying. Most of them were written by people in the 1st and 2nd century who subscribed to basically the first heresy called Gnosticism. So it basically rejected that Jesus was the Son of God, and that the Old Testament God and the New Testament God were different gods. So already right there, it's like, well, you've just rejected the entire Bible. And now you're writing a letter saying, oh, this should be included in what the New Testament is. So they were very different things. If you want more specifics, I can go into those, but that's the basic message of why certain books were not included.
Yeah, I'll hop in because that was a really great question. If you guys are looking for good resources, and Daniel may be bringing this up later, but with that particular question, there's a book that an author named Lee Strobel wrote. His first book was Case for Christ, which deals with the reliability of the especially the New Testament documents and who Jesus was. But this one right here deals with, are there other books out there? Why weren't they included, and so forth? And so, I see Carson is supporting the Case for Christ itself. So, but what is so good about Lee Strobel is kind of like Daniel's position there. He's a cold hard facts guy who wanted to know the truth, and so he set out to kind of disprove Christianity. And in interviewing theologians and Christian philosophers and intellectuals, he was convinced otherwise. So anyhow, the Case for the Real Jesus, and then the Case for Christ is just a couple of the books in this series.
All right, what other questions do we have? I know I didn't knock it out of the park that good. Surely there's something on your mind.
Hey, Daniel. Okay, I have a question. Maybe I shouldn't ask this, but I'd love to hear more about your journey in just, was there anything, when did it hit you as you were looking up these things and wanting the cold, hard facts? When did it hit you that it was like, whoa, who is this Jesus guy? Or I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about your experience.
Yeah, that's a great question, Lauren. Yeah, I think the determining factor for me was some of that stuff that we talked about already, like something like the Dead Sea Scrolls, like again, being such a recent discovery, there's no denying it. And like, okay, so I know that this is the same book. It's got the same cohesive message. The Old Testament and the New Testament agree with each other in the sense that the Old Testament is prophesying all this stuff is going to happen. Hey, Jesus is going to come. There's going to be a Messiah. New Testament, he comes. All of this stuff comes to pass. And I'm just sitting there like, there's no freaking way. Like, there's no way that this all actually happened. That's crazy. I mean, it was beyond all rationality to me. And yet, everywhere that I turned, there was an explanation for something. I think the thing that really did it to me the most as I looked at Jesus's death was that so many people who wanted him dead, like Jewish leaders and religious leaders and people who thought that he was just causing some huge problems, you know, stirring up the whole climate, after he died and then physically resurrected, they started following him. The very people who wanted him gone said, oh my gosh, I was wrong. And that really spoke volumes to me, because if Jesus was a liar, if he isn't who he says he is, there's a lot of conspiracy theories, obviously, or things about like, well, what happened to his body? Maybe someone come in and stole it, or, you know, they came in and stole it, whatever. If he's who he says he is, like people would not be doing that, you know, like people who wanted him dead would be rejoicing. They would be happy that he was finally gone. He was like a huge thorn in their side. And yet after he resurrects and, you know, proves that he is who he says that he is, they have a complete change of heart. You know, and you look at people like Paul, who was a Jewish person who was killing Christians, he was persecuting the early church, you know, turns around and does what he does to where he actually dies for, you know, for his faith in Christ. That spoke a lot of volumes to me, because facts are one thing, you know, you can look at all the facts you want all day, but then, you know, there's the faith component of like, these people trusted him like with everything, with their lives. And that, I think, just really, I was in a place in my life where I needed hope, and I needed the promise of like an eternity, and that life is more than just what we see right here, because that's what I experienced my first 17 years of my life. Like there was no getting better than what I had. So I think that those are the main things. Thanks for asking. What else do we have? We got about 10-15 minutes, and yeah, obviously you're free to stay, and we can keep chatting. I got all night, so, but want to respect your time.
Daniel, I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting here with my roommate, and she is kind of wondering, and I thought this was an interesting question. So when you brought up the Dead Sea Scrolls, I believe that's what you said, we were wondering, like, how do they know that it's from 100 BC or whatever BC, that, like, is there, how do they know that?
I can't tell you 100% the specifics. Certainly in like the writing style and the way that the type of paper, you know, parchment, things that it was written on. Basically, the main point is that this group of farmers that were the ones who penned the letter, you know, I can't know exactly how they knew it was them, but they knew that they were occupying that region from 150 BC to 70 AD. Did they date the copies? Honestly, it's probably pretty likely that they did. Quinn says carbon dating in the chat. Yeah, I don't know enough about, honestly, like the forensic side and the scientific side to know how they're able to get exact dates, but they knew who penned it, like what people group penned it, what time period they were in that particular region, And again, you look at the writing and the style that was used, plus types of things that they wrote on, all of that usually are very specific to time periods. So hope that that's helpful.
Yeah, that is. Thank you for answering that.
Yeah, honestly, I'll expand on that even a little bit. I think that we have this compressed view of the past. Like when we think about 100 BC to like 50 AD or whatever, we think that it's like, it's all the same. It all blends in together. But if you think about right now in 2020, if we were to like look at someone, like a picture of someone from the 1800s and just like look at their style, we would know very quickly that they're like from a long time ago, because of the way that they dress, the way that they talk, the ways that they would write, whatever it is, the language that they would use. So I think that we tend to think of like, oh yeah, first century, second century, it's all the same, but there were huge differences in culture and obviously advancements in different things. So they're able to date stuff pretty effectively just based on that. Even if we look at something from like the 1980s, if we looked at Phil, Phil back in the day and the outfit he was wearing, we would be able to say, oh, he's not a teenager or whatever in today's culture, just based on fashion and, different things. So they're able to date stuff pretty accurately, even back then. When were the scrolls discovered? In 1946. So there was basically like 3 archaeological digs that got scheduled. So there were 3 caves that they found stuff in between 1946 and 1951. So like I said, less than 100 years ago, which is hard to believe that we found like a copy of Isaiah from 100 BC, like 80 years ago in a cave.
Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was first discovered when a Bedouin, one of the shepherd guys around there, threw a rock into the cave and he heard a clay pot break. And I wonder what that was.
Yeah,
it's pretty amazing that it get almost like the perfect time God would allow something like that to happen.
Yeah, it is wild. And like I said, they go up there, they start investigating these pots. Like, what the heck is all this stuff? They had no clue. And they kept it in their Bedouin like encampment or whatever until they could get into town. So it was just like they were just carrying this thing around for like weeks before they actually got it to like, and there were a couple pieces that got a little bit destroyed along the way. It's like, do you realize what the heck you're carrying right now? They had no idea. So how cool is that?
I think what you brought up earlier about maybe you didn't phrase it this way, but intellectual integrity or intellectual honesty. The New Testament in the Bible does not get the same treatment that other works of antiquity do. And I think it's fair to say primarily based upon what the Bible says. Because it says what it says, we have a problem with it because it makes a claim on my life. What do you mean? You care about what I do with my girlfriend? God, you start doing that type of stuff like, well, I'm not so sure that's an accurate book that you have. And yet, like you said, if it was in a court of law, I don't think there would be a problem with how the verdict would go.
Right. It is really interesting because we have no problem studying Homer in school or Plato or Aristotle or all these guys from Greek history and the things that they wrote, because it's not controversial to read the things that they wrote. It's just history, it's philosophy, it's interesting, but if you read the Bible just as literature, forget about the claims that it makes and things like that. Again, it's like, one of the most historical books that you could read. Certainly gives you a lot of insight into the time period and into the culture and into different things that was going on. But yet then you add the faith aspect to it and all of a sudden it's no longer just a piece of literature. It becomes a lot more than that. I got a question in the chat here that says, why is there such a gap of people and religions who believe in the historical events surrounding Jesus, who acknowledge his existence, yet disprove his resurrection? Really good question, because it's true. That is obviously the foundation for the Jewish faith, that they don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. They don't believe that he was, he was who he says he was. They thought that he was kind of a crazy Jew who got killed for his trouble. Obviously Islam, also recognizes the existence of Jesus, but they don't think that he's God. So why is that? And again, I think that you can do with the evidence what you want to do with it. You can see all of the things that happen, and you can't deny that Jesus didn't exist. Which, there's people that try to do that, and it's like, that's just, that's like saying that George Washington didn't exist or whatever. We didn't have a first president of the United States. Like, it's so historically accurate, like recorded, that we couldn't say, oh, he wasn't a guy. But what was he? He could have been a lot of things. He could have just been a nice guy who was a good teacher, which is what a lot of people try to make him out to be. Again, he could have just been like another Jewish guy. He's not the son of God. He's just a religious leader. So you can look at the things that he did and make that decision for yourself. Do I think that there's enough evidence for the resurrection that I would say those positions are wrong? Yes, but that's that's the deduction that I've come to based on the information. Again, with the resurrection, common thing, like I mentioned earlier, they took his body. The disciples came in and stole his body. That's why they never found it in the tomb. Well, I mean, that tomb was being guarded by Roman soldiers 24 hours of the day. They had a huge stone in front of it, huger than any of us could move. These disciples were not the world's strongest men. They were basic tradesmen, like I said, like fishermen. They're not going to come in the middle of the night, fight off all these Roman guards, move this stone, and then carry Jesus's body out of the tomb. That just doesn't make sense to me. I don't see how that could physically be possible. So that, combined with, the next Spartan training topic, how the heck? We're definitely getting into, is Jesus really who he says he was, or is he the only way? So that sets up Phil's time for the next one really well. But again, I don't think that you can prove the conspiracy theories. So the fact that, again, the tomb's empty, we know that he was physically crucified. We have accounts of that. We know that he was buried in this tomb, and we know that the tomb was empty. And we know that the people who wanted him dead, like I mentioned before, are now following him. How do you explain that? I don't think that there is a good way to explain that, other than he is who he says he is. You can come to a different conclusion, but that's the conclusion that makes the most sense to me. So.
Can I add a comment to that question?
Absolutely.
I think it was, again, Daniel, you mentioned Judaism and Islam. How can you believe in historical Jesus but not believe in the resurrection? There's such a thing as circular reasoning. Lots of people do it. I would argue even naturalists and evolutionists do it to a degree, that you buy into your conclusion, and then therefore you look at all the evidence in light of the conclusion that you've already made up your mind on. Right? If you believe that the world has no, it's a closed system, there's no God out there who could do a miracle, then anything you see that would be a miracle, you've already made up your mind that it can't be a miracle, so you have to explain it another way. Or if the earth looks like it's designed, you already made up your mind that it's not designed, so you're saying, gee, wow, look at what nature did, it looks designed. So in Islam, for instance, Islamic theologians will say this: Allah is not to be known, he is to be obeyed. When you have a monotheistic religion that's monotheistic in the sense that one God, one essence, one person, boom. The Bible would say one God, one essence, one what, but three who's. Not three different gods. There's a plurality within the three, which allows for a God who can be perfectly satisfied in himself in eternity past. He can love each other. He's personal. He can be known. In Islam, you don't have that. So you don't have a category that Allah cannot manifest himself as a physical person. He can't. He can't be known. He would not stoop himself to that. And so when you buy into that, it's hard to accept the evidence that would point to the fact that he did rise. Why? Because you've already embraced the fact that he can't. And in Judaism, kind of the same thing, and yet embedded in the scriptures, Isaiah chapter 53, it talks about this suffering servant would be resurrected and see the light of life. So I think when you're talking with people, having that type of understanding in there, that their theological framework kind of prohibits them from even going there. But again, you have to be honest with the evidence. So
That's good. Well, it is 9 o'clock now. I want to respect your time. So this will conclude, the formal time. But if there's still things that you're curious about, I will stick around. Just if you have to go, if you've got things to do, feel free to leave now. But yeah, please feel free to stick around as well if you've got things you want to talk about.